Greetings, friends. You are on Ruslan Belov's channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine as of August 31st, 2025. A large number of events took place today, so let's get started. Let's begin with the southern region. Today, sources report that the armed forces of the Russian Federation launched a massive strike on the Odessa region, mainly targeting settlements such as Alexandrovka, Chornomorsk, and others. As you can see, there is a fairly large and extensive port infrastructure here, which is used by the armed forces of Ukraine and by Ukraine in general for international trade, and, of course, primarily for supplying Ukraine with weapons from Western countries, both through grey schemes and direct deliveries from NATO states. In other words, the Odessa region plays a key role in ensuring the combat capability of the Ukrainian armed forces, and that is precisely why strikes were carried out here. During the night, a large number of explosions and drones were recorded. Later, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine issued a short report concerning air defense activity. Ukrainian sources claimed that a total of 142 drones were used during the night, 126 of which were shot down. And judging by apparently objective control footage, most of these drones were heading toward the Odessa region. According to certain experts who analyzed the explosions, the fires, and satellite images of thermal anomalies, they concluded that serious damage had been inflicted on the logistics of the Ukrainian armed forces. Without major repairs, the efficiency of this port infrastructure will be significantly reduced. Of course, this will not completely destroy or eliminate Ukrainian logistics, but its restoration will definitely take time. Some additional strikes were also carried out on settlements such as Sinelnikov. Let me remind you that in recent days, strikes had been carried out on Pavlohrad as well. As for Pavlohrad, fire anomalies are still being recorded there, in simple terms, ongoing fires. The strikes targeted the Pavlohrad chemical plant and various factories that, according to intelligence and Russian sources, were used by Ukraine for producing fuel, as well as components for Ukrainian missiles, and so on. Moving on, attention should also be paid to Sinelnikova. This was where strikes were carried out last night, from August 30 to 31. According to objective control footage and open-source information, strikes were directed at Ukrainian armed forces units that had been redeployed to Sinelnikova, possibly for further movement either to the Zaporizhzhia sector or the Pokrovsk direction. In any case, if we sum up, we can clearly conclude that over the past 2 days, strikes have targeted Odessa and the Odessa region, that is, logistics, as well as settlements located along the main railway arteries of southern Ukraine, between Zaporizhzhia, Dnipro, Pokrovsk, and Kyiv. Pavlohrad and Sinelnikov were among them. So it is absolutely clear that Russian forces have prioritized strikes on logistics. Why strikes on logistics right now? Well, we all understand that the Russian army is actively advancing in the eastern Zaporizhzhia sector, the Novopavlivka direction, and the Mirnohrad-Pokrovsk direction. Moreover, today some pro-Western analysts and experts claim that these days, late August and possibly early September, the Russian army is completing its strategic regrouping. Western experts report that Russian forces are redeploying reserves from the Kherson and Sumy sectors precisely toward Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka, where an offensive may begin soon. Furthermore, some pro-Ukrainian experts and MPs stated today that tomorrow or the day after, a new large-scale offensive by the Russian armed forces may begin. Naturally, once Russian units began moving toward Pokrovsk, mirrored actions from the Ukrainian side were also to be expected. That is why strikes on logistics, railways, and temporary deployment sites are aimed at disrupting the redeployment of Ukrainian reinforcements toward Pokrovsk, giving Russian forces at least a few days' advantage. It's hard to say yet whether this goal was achieved, but we will certainly find out in the coming days. Now let's move to the front line, starting with the eastern Zaporizhzhia sector, where the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue their offensive. Let me remind you that yesterday, according to objective control footage, Russian forces managed to take full control of the settlement of Kamyshevaka. At that time, footage was published showing Russian soldiers raising flags. Today, the Russian army continued its advance westward, and cartographers reported an expansion of the controlled zone between Malivka and Kamyshevaka. This information is confirmed by virtually all cartographers. pro-Ukrainian, neutral, and pro-Russian alike. In general, reports also indicate that Russian forces have begun storming the settlement of Berezovye, a small village, but compared to others in this area, it is likely the largest. Its size and territory explain why it was chosen as a priority target. Russian units are moving between these small villages westward, and naturally, the larger the settlement, the greater the opportunities for concentrating additional forces and resources for further advances. That is why the storming of Berezov began today, according to incoming reports. We may soon receive the first objective control footage, and perhaps Russian forces will achieve rapid progress there. Russian units are also continuing their advance toward the settlements of Koroshe and Sosnivka, and fighting continues along the line of Yanvarske-Novoselka. According to pro-Ukrainian cartographers, in recent days Russian units managed to enter the northern part of this settlement, though the territory was later marked back in Ukrainian control. Overall, the route of the Russian army's advance is becoming clearer, and I want to highlight one very important point. Fighting is ongoing here, and perhaps almost unnoticed, some major changes have occurred. Let me remind you that not long ago, battles were taking place for Velika Novosilka. That is the Mokry Yali River, and after the fall of Velika Novosilka, the Russian army set itself the goal of advancing from the Mokry Yali River to the R85 highway or the Haichel River. That river and road remain the Russian army's objectives. At the time of the fall of Velika Novosilka, the distance between the Mokry Yali River and the R85 road was 46 km. Today, the distance from Velika Novosilka to the forward positions of the Russian army is already 21 kilometers. So we can conclude that gradually, almost unnoticed, grinding down all these settlements and Ukrainian reinforcements, the Russian army has already covered nearly half of this distance. And of course, the advance continues. Soon, Russian units will reach the distance where they will begin targeting settlements such as Pokrovsk and Huliaipole. Based on the current pace of the offensive, battles for Huliaipole could begin in roughly 6 months. That is, during the early spring campaign. Next, we move to the Pokrovsk sector, which has also brought many important updates. If we look at the southwestern part, most maps, whether from various cartographers or those provided yesterday by the Ministry of Defense and General Staff, are almost identical, with nothing significant to highlight. But today, certain experts report that the Russian army managed to advance along the southern flank of Pokrovsk, clearing the strongpoint known as Babochka. Moreover, pro-Russian experts note further Russian advances in the southern part of Pokrovsk itself. The advance is moving along, let's say, small houses in the private sector, right across from the Pokrovsk citadel. Experts also report that Russian units have managed to regain control over areas near the M30 highway. These are the territories that the Ukrainian side had managed to retake over the past few weeks during its counter-offensive. And overall, we can now see that the Ukrainian counter-offensive in the southwestern part of Pokrovsk has stalled, in fact collapsed. After a short regrouping, the Russian army began to push deeper into the town again. Next, we move on to the northeastern flank of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Let's begin with Mirnograd. Today, several important, let's say, officials reported that Russian units, the first groups made up of sabotage and reconnaissance teams, managed to enter Mirnograd. Where exactly the Russian soldiers entered the town is unclear, but most likely we're talking either about the northeastern outskirts or possibly the southeastern edge, in the area of the settlements Promin, Kazatskaya, and Balagan. Moreover, today there appeared footage of objective control that clearly confirms the presence of Russian units on the territory of the mine. In these recordings, we can observe drone strikes on Russian troops in various parts of the settlement, including on the grounds of the Mirnograd mine. Next, we move to the very northeastern arc. Here, naturally, the first discrepancies arise between the report of the General Staff of the Russian Federation and the materials distributed today by various sources. According to the General Staff's report, at the moment the Russian army fully controls all the areas where the breakthrough took place a few days or weeks ago. In addition, by the General Staff's map, the Russian armed forces now control approximately these fields, tree lines, and wooded areas south of the settlement of Gruzskaya, as well as already being at the approaches and outskirts of Novomikhailovka. This is quite a significant breakthrough, which Russian units are seeking to expand in order to complete the encirclement in the areas of Toretsk and Sofiyivka. Furthermore, today very important videos emerged from the Shukhovsky pocket. In these recordings, you can see Ukrainian troops trying to deliver ammunition to the front line for their fighters holding positions, and then Russian aviation striking these places with aerial bombs. The video itself is nothing unusual. Similar footage can be seen in many areas along the contact line. The significance of these recordings is that the attacks were carried out by the Smugly-Anka detachment. And let me remind you that these very units we just saw in the footage had been operating only 2 weeks ago in the Kondratievka sector in the Sumy region. This is yet another video, another fragment, another case supporting the broader concept and conclusions of Western analysts that the Russian army is now redeploying all its resources toward Pokrovsk from Kherson and Sumy in order to possibly radically change the situation in the battle for the Pokrovsk agglomeration. So here we are seeing real confirmation of this. We then move on to the Lyman and Siversk sectors of the front, where changes are being recorded. In fact, battles are already underway for Lyman, and the Russian army clearly has no intention of stopping. It's only a matter of time, maybe a month, maybe a few weeks, before Russian units secure the outskirts of this city. As for the current situation, all cartographers confirm that the battles for Zarekne are nearing completion. The Russian army has entrenched itself on the Ukrainian side of the Zherebets River and is practically finishing the clearing of the settlement. Today, pro-Ukrainian cartographers made the corresponding corrections, shrinking the bridgehead of Ukrainian units on this bank, and some pro-Western analysts confirm that the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in Zarekne has collapsed, and Ukrainian units are preparing for redeployment and withdrawal toward Lyman. At the same time, Russian forces are completing the encirclement of the settlement of Shandryholov. By the way, information about Shandryholov was confirmed for the first time yesterday by the General Staff itself. On their maps, they marked that Shandryholov is in complete operational encirclement. For personnel, there remains only the possibility of retreat westward and southwestward across the Nitrius River. At the moment, communication with the village has been completely cut off, and likely very soon, Shandryholov will fall fully under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, after which the Russian army will of course push southwest toward Novoselivka, and also toward Derelov, and after Derelov will come Drobyshev. In fact, with the beginning of battles for Drobyshev, the battle for Lyman will begin. Third, we then move to the Borov direction. Here, truly remarkable events are taking place. Over the last few days, pro-Russian experts, neutral observers, and Western cartographers have been publishing a lot of intriguing information. Let me remind you that in recent days, the 3rd Assault Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine carried out counterattacks toward Redkudub as well as toward Novomykhailovka. And in the first days of these strikes, both settlements ended up either in the grey zone, or under fire control, or under Ukrainian control. But overall, Ukrainian control seemed more noticeable than Russian. At the same time, Russian units simultaneously launched an offensive toward Glushchenkovo, as well as advancing in the Grekovka area. Today, reports state that Ukrainian troops are trying to continue counterattacks on Novomykhailovka and Redkudub. Meanwhile, it is reported that the Russian army has cleared Malivka, Glushchenkovo, and the settlement of Andreevka. So overall, a meeting engagement occurred. But judging by the videos and publications from various experts, including independent and Western ones, the Russian army achieved much greater success, and in fact Ukrainian formations now risk being encircled. It seems here that a decisive turning point in the battles will soon occur, and overall the breakthrough of Russian forces on the southeastern Borov front could lead to a complete collapse of the defense both in the central Kupyansk sector and the southern Kupyansk, that is, Lyman sectors. Next, we move on to the Kupyansk sector of the front, and here it is worth returning once again to the General Staff's map released yesterday. And let me remind you that also yesterday, when analyzing the map, the report, and everything else presented by Gerasimov, 2 key conclusions were made. Gerasimov stated that fighting is now taking place within the settlement of Siversk. We missed that, so let's briefly return. According to the map of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, at the moment the Russian army already controls roughly this semicircle around Siversk, meaning they have approached right up to this industrial complex, with the roads and tree lines north and northeast of Kupyansk already under the full control of the Russian armed forces. In addition, by the General Staff's map, Russian units have created a narrow corridor allowing entry into the northern part of Siversk, roughly along this route. Also, according to the General Staff's map, the Russian army controls approximately this territory southeast of Siversk. So from this side too, Russian units have approached close to the Ukrainian strongpoints on the eastern Sloviansk axis. And now we quickly return to Kupyansk. So then, by the map of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, as well as Gerasimov's report, at the moment already 50% of Kupyansk is under the control of the Russian armed forces. In addition, Gerasimov stated that the city is almost fully blockaded. If you look even at the General Staff's map from August 30th, then according to their data, Russian units approximately control these areas, meaning this salient, this pocket, this bulge, up to the settlement of Osinovo, which is under the full control of the Russian armed forces. We've been discussing this information with you in recent days. We expected that perhaps someone would provide confirmation in the form of geolocation. But over these days, nothing of the sort has appeared. Still, the report is quite intriguing. Of course, we'll be watching to see how the situation develops, whether evidence appears of control west of Kupyansk, of a breakthrough on the Borov axis, and naturally of a semicircle around Siversk already in 2 spots, and, even more so, of a push toward Kramatorsk. Of course, we are waiting for this information, but for now we will not correct anything based on the General Staff of the Russian Federation, simply because it's difficult to pass, even from such a perspective, exactly where the front line runs. For now we will rely on what we have and wait perhaps for a new wave of offensive from the Russian Federation, which should begin in the coming days. And that's all, dear friends. Thank you for watching, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and all the best to you.